First story. When I was a child, I often spent my summer holidays at my grandmother's house. The house was as old as time itself and filled with 1,000 secrets and mysteries. My grandmother told me amazing stories about this place, but one day I encountered something that forever changed my understanding of home and childhood. This happened in the summer when I was only 10 years old. I was rummaging through old cabinets trying to find something interesting to entertain me with. And then, among the old blankets and books, I saw her, an old wooden doll in an old dress. The doll was covered in a layer of dust and appeared to have not seen the light of day for decades. But she was wonderful. I took the doll and started playing with it. We played all day long, and I even gave her a name, Anna. She seemed to be alive. However, over time, something began to change. When I got tired and left the game, the doll seemed to remain in place, but after a while I found it in a different place. At the beginning, I thought that my grandmother was just trying to play a prank on me, but she was too old to pull such pranks. I told her about the strange movements of the doll, but she just grinned and said that this was my childhood fantasy. But one day something happened that made me think. I went into the room where I usually played with Anna and found her lying on the floor inside a circle of some strange symbols drawn in red paint. I had never seen these symbols and I felt a little scared. I decided to return the doll to its place, but it was icy to the touch. Suddenly, there was a whisper in the room, and it seemed to me that the doll was smiling. It was an ominous moment that made me realize that Anna was no ordinary doll. My nerves were on edge, but I was scared to leave the doll in that room. Took Anna and went outside, thinking that the fresh air and sun would dispel my fears. But something was wrong. When I went outside, the world around me seemed different, and the air was filled with a strange sound, like moans and whispers. I tried to get away from home, but wherever I went, I always ended up in front of him. The house, as if alive, refused to let me leave. At some point, I realized that there was no sun in the sky, and the day turned into night without sunset. Horrified, I returned to the house and locked myself in the room. There, on the wall, I saw a strange photograph, my grandmother holding exactly the same Anna doll in her hands. Under the photo, there was text written in an unfamiliar language, and I could not decipher it. Every minute I felt like reality was decaying, and the world around me was becoming more and more dark and gloomy. The Anna doll seemed to become a portal to some kind of nightmare world, and she pulled me inside. I didn't know how to get out of this nightmare situation. My grandmother seemed to know something about the doll and this house, but she could not help me. I remained locked in the room, praying that this evil spell would break so that I could return to reality. My parents returned a few days later to find me sitting in a dark room, surrounded by strange symbols and an Anna doll. They immediately called emergency services and doctors. I was shocked and truly horrified. Since then, I never returned to that house, and the Anna doll remained a mystery that I could never solve. Second story. When I was a child, I liked computer games, especially those where you had to find objects and solve puzzles. One day, my friend Michael invited me to play a new game that he downloaded from the internet. It was called Hidden Objects, Abandoned School. The game started as usual. We had to find hidden objects in an old abandoned school. The gloomy atmosphere and otherworldly sounds created a feeling of real adventure. We loaded into the game, and I noticed that everything inside the school looked very realistic. The walls were covered in graffiti, the windows were broken, and the offices were quite neglected. We started looking for items and solving puzzles as usual, but as we progressed in the game, something began to bother me. It seems the game has become increasingly strange and dark. We discovered a room with portraits of missing children who attended this school many years ago. The sounds of children's footsteps and laughter were heard in the distance, as if the ghosts of past times were coming to life inside this school. Just when we began to realize that the game had become too realistic, something terrible happened. Michael suddenly disappeared from the game. I screamed his name, but he didn't answer. Inside the game, I was wandering around an abandoned school, and suddenly I noticed that maniacs began to chase me. I tried to get out of the game, but the controls stopped responding. The maniacs were getting closer and closer, and I realized that the game had become a nightmare. Suddenly, one of the maniacs slowly turns towards me, and his face emerges from the darkness. The next moment he pierces me with his gaze, and the world around me disappears. I woke up in the real world, but the horror of what happened remained inside me. Michael was never found, and his disappearance remains a mystery. I'm never going to play a game like this again, and I hope no one else has to face a similar nightmare. I went back to living my everyday life, but the memories of that terrible incident inside the game did not leave me. I spent days and nights trying to understand what happened and looking for any trace of Michael. Ironically, one day I came across an article in a local newspaper. It stated that human remains had been found in the old abandoned school that was the basis for the game. The police began an investigation, and it turned out that this place had long been known as a place where children disappeared. My guess that the game was connected to real events turned out to be correct. Michael was never found, and his name was added to the list of missing children. I immediately contacted the police and told them what happened inside the game. An investigation began, but no evidence emerged about Michael's fate. This incident became one of the most strange and inexplicable events in our city. Sometimes I think that if I had not left the game, I too would have disappeared inside this dark reality. But one thing I know for sure is that games can be not only entertainment, but also a door to a world of nightmares that is better not to open. Third story. This summer was the most terrible time of my life. My parents sent me and my friends Jason and Emma to Camp Sunshine Holidays so we could have an active and carefree holiday. But now it seems to me that this was the biggest mistake in our lives. The camp was located in a picturesque forest surrounded by mountains. It all started out fun. We swam in the lake, went hiking and played sports. The camp was full of fun and laughter, and we were sure it would be a summer to remember. However, one day, shortly after lunch, a strange thing happened. All the teachers and children gathered in the central area where meetings were usually held. But this time, the meeting was truly strange. The camp director, Mr. Smith, stood in front of us with a serious expression on his face. He announced that the camp must be closed due to urgent circumstances, and everyone must pack up their belongings and return to their parents. We were shocked and disappointed. It seemed like some kind of mistake. But Mr. Smith was categorical. We collected our things and headed to the bus that was supposed to take us back to the city. But when we arrived at the place where the camp was supposed to be, our world collapsed. There was nothing there. No camp, no building, no sign that our summer had once been here. We stood in front of an empty space and couldn't believe our eyes. Where are our friends, teachers, and the whole life of the camp? He simply disappeared as if he had never existed. We returned home, but it was only a shadow of the camp in which we had spent so many bright days. We never managed to find answers to the questions of what happened and where everyone we knew disappeared to. But this summer will forever remain in our memory as the most mysterious and terrible time of our lives. Time has passed, but the mystery of the disappearance of the sunny vacation camp has not been solved. The parents of the children sent to the camp began to contact the police and the press, but all efforts remained in vain. No one could offer a clear explanation for what happened. We friends continued to communicate, trying to unravel the mystery of the disappearance. We talked about what we saw and felt there, but nothing was connected into a logical chain. Emma even claimed to have seen some strange glowing figures in the forest, but it sounded too unreal. We did not forget our friends from the camp and continued to look for any clues. One day, Jason found an old photograph of us sitting in front of one of the camp huts. This was confirmation that the camp existed, but did not answer the question of where all its inhabitants had disappeared to. Summer ended, and we returned to school, but neither of us could forget about our missing friends. We remained searching, hoping that somewhere out there they were alive and safe. But the mystery of the Sunshine Vacation Camp remained unsolved, and it continued to torment our thoughts and hearts. Over time, that mysterious story became part of our personal legend. We told it to others, hoping someone might offer an explanation. But the missing camp remained a mystery that remained unsolved. And still, sometimes, in my dreams, I return there, to that deserted clearing where there once was a camp, and look for answers that I never found. Fourth story. Since childhood, I was an eternal storyteller and dreamer, and was mostly ignored when I started telling some incredible stories. But the day I said there was a real monster living under my bed, my family thought it was just another one of my made-up stories. Nobody believed me. I behaved stubbornly and continued to insist on my version. I claimed that at night I heard strange sounds, rustling sounds, and even his breathing. But Mom and Dad thought it was my overactive imagination and worried that I was starting to avoid sleep because of my fears. But overnight everything changed. I was lying in bed, trying to sleep, when I heard a dull grinding sound and felt the bed begin to sway. I was scared, but I decided that it might just be my imagination. However, then something pulled my leg. I squealed and got out from under the blanket excitedly. The room was dark, and I only saw the silhouette of whoever was under the bed. In a panic, I rushed to the door, closing it with a bolt. My screams attracted the attention of my parents, who came to my room to find out what had happened. I told them what happened, and they decided to check if there was someone under my bed. They lifted the blanket and looked in. There was no one under the bed. My parents tried to calm me down and told me it was just a nightmare, but I was so sure of what I saw that I could not believe them. I fell asleep in their bedroom that night and didn't want to sleep in my room anymore. In the days following the incident, strange things seemed to start happening in the house. Things were disappearing. I heard rustles and sounds that I had not noticed before. I was sure that the monster that used to hide under my bed was now freely roaming around our house. But no one except me believed in the existence of this monster. My parents began to worry about my health and mental state, but I was so stubborn and convinced of my vision that I did not give up. I decided to find out for myself what was really going on in my room. One night, when everyone was sleeping, I decided to conduct my own investigation. I prepared a flashlight, climbed under the bed, and began to look into all corners, looking for the monster. At first, nothing was found, and I calmed down a little. But then, when I felt something touch my leg, horror took over me. I slowly lowered the flashlight lower and saw two pale hands that stuck out from under the bed and tried to grab me. I screamed and ran out from under the bed without looking back. My parents heard my scream and came running to my room. I told them what I saw, but when we returned to the bed, there was nothing there. My parents thought that I suffered from obsessive phobias and decided to see a specialist. I took a number of psychological tests, and they all indicated that I was experiencing strange illusions and fantasies. The doctor thought that the best solution would be to change the situation, and we moved to another house. After the move, all fears and unexplained phenomena ceased. I no longer saw the monster under the bed and did not hear its rustling sounds. But to this day, I am sure that that monster was real, and sometimes I have nightmares that it always remains in my subconscious, waiting for its moment to return. Fifth story. When my parents hired a new nanny named Mrs. Jensen, she seemed perfect. Her recommendations were impeccable, and she came across as a kind, caring woman. We children were delighted when she came to our house on the first day. Mrs. Jensen looked after us with such care and attention that it seemed like she truly was the best nanny in the world. She cooked us delicious dinners, played with us, read us fairy tales before bed. We thought she was a real guardian angel. But over time, strange things began to happen. We sometimes saw Mrs. Jensen talking to someone in a dark room, but when we approached, no one was there. She sometimes behaved strangely, as if communicating with invisible beings. One night, when I couldn't sleep, I heard whispering and laughing, and I knew it was coming from Mrs. Jensen's room. I carefully got out of bed and looked into her room. There she stood in the middle of the room and waved her arms as if communicating with invisible children. I got scared and rushed back to my room. I told my sister about this, and we decided to ask each other about our observations. It turned out that she also saw strange things, and we decided to tell our parents about it. But when we did this, they didn't believe us and said that we were just making up stories. We decided to find out for ourselves what was going on. We started watching Mrs. Jensen and hiding to monitor her behavior. And one day we saw her real face. She stood in the room with her mouth open and her eyes burning. Her skin as pale as a corpse. Her voice made strange sounds and her body distorted as if she had turned into something terrible. We got scared and ran out of the house, ran to the neighbors and told them that Mrs. Jensen was a monster. Our parents finally listened to us, and they called the police. Mrs. Jensen was arrested, and when the police searched her room, they discovered strange artifacts and spells that she used to communicate with evil forces. We had been rescued from something incredibly sinister, and it was the scariest thing we had ever experienced. With Mrs. Jensen arrested and her secret revealed, we felt much safer. Our parents apologized to us and admitted that they didn't believe us because they thought it was just a child's fantasy. Now they promised to be more attentive to our concerns and fears. Our family experienced this terrible event together, and it brought us closer. We no longer hired a nanny and began spending more time together. We learned to be more vigilant and intelligent, and this became an important lesson for us. However, as time passed, the fear of Mrs. Jensen and her terrible secrets gradually subsided, and we regained normalcy in our lives. But we were always left with some sense of bewilderment as to how this could happen in our own family. It reminded us that there are dark and strange sides to the world that we should never underestimate. Sixth story. My life in those days was ordinary, full of joy and serenity. I was a happy child who drew every day and dreamed about the future. My parents always supported me and admired my drawings. But one day everything changed. This day was special. I decided to draw something more, something that would be special. Taking a piece of paper and colored pencils, I began to create. The drawing turned out to be unusual. I saw it in my head, and it poured out onto paper like never before. A terrible image appeared on the paper, which filled me with horror. It was something out of my artistic nightmares. I drew a face contorted with fear, with tears of blood flowing through my eyes. The creature had a knife in his hands, and his fingers were bloody. The drawing was dark and frightening. I looked at my drawing with horror and fear. I couldn't understand where such an image came into my head. It was far from what I usually drew. But the worst thing was that I felt that this was not just a drawing, but a warning. I showed my drawing to my parents, and their faces contorted in horror when they saw it. They started asking me where this terrible idea came from, but I could not explain. I myself did not know what kind of creature it was in the picture, and why I drew it. As the days passed, my parents became increasingly worried. They began to notice something strange around us. We heard whispers that seemed to come from the walls, and nightmares became our daily occurrence. One day, returning from school, I discovered that the drawing had disappeared. He simply disappeared from the sheet of paper as if he had never existed, but the horror was far from over. This was just the beginning of a nightmare that would change our lives forever. After the drawing disappeared, our family hoped that everything would return to normal. But the horrors only intensified. We kept hearing strange noises coming from the walls, and our nightmares became more terrifying. My parents began to argue and quarrel more and more often. They stopped leaving the house and began to avoid society. One day, the night after a terrible nightmare, we heard footsteps in the corridor. These were the steps of the creature depicted in the picture. They were approaching our bedroom, and we were paralyzed with fear. The door opened slowly, and in the doorway stood a creature with a face contorted in horror. It carried a knife in its hand, and its eyes sparkled in the darkness. We screamed, and the creature rushed at us. My parents protected me, but they were powerless against his attack. We were fighting for our lives, and at some point the creature seemed to retreat and disappear into the shadows. We were left crying hysterically and terrified. After this incident, our parents decided to leave this house and move to another place, hoping that this would help us get rid of the nightmares. But our souls remained forever stained with fear, and we were never able to completely forget the terrible drawing and the creature it evoked. What happened to us remained our family's secret, and we rarely talked about it. We realized that this was something more reliable than an ordinary nightmare, and despite the fact that many years had passed, we always remained alert and careful in our actions. Our lives were forever changed by this terrible drawing, which attracted something into our world that could not be described in words. Seventh story. Summer was in full swing, and my friends and I decided to explore the area in which we lived. We knew every corner of this area, but one day we managed to find something new, an old abandoned playground heap in the forest. She was hidden from view among tall trees, and only accidentally came into our field of vision. The sight looked strange. The swing hung motionless, the sand in the sandbox was distorted by the water, and the carousel rotated slowly even in the absence of wind. We decided that this was a great place to play, so we started riding on the carousel, swinging on the swings and playing in the sand. But as the minutes passed, something began to bother me. Gradually, we began to feel as if someone was watching us. We turned around, but didn't see anyone. But the feeling did not leave us. Suddenly, one of my friends, Jason, noticed that his hand was covered in blood. He screamed in fear, and we found ourselves covered in many small cuts and scrapes. We didn't understand where they could have come from. There was nothing sharp on the site that could have hurt us. We decided to leave this place, but as soon as we got up from the carousel, the playground came to life. The swing began to swing on its own, as if someone was sitting on it, and the carousel was spinning faster and faster. We started to run, but the sounds of a terrible child's laughter and crying filled the air. We ran out of the forest, frightened and mad with fear. At home, we checked our hands and found that the cuts had disappeared, as if they had never been there. But that day remained forever in our memory, reminding us that sometimes abandoned places keep secrets and dangers that are best left untouched. After that incident, we never returned to that abandoned playground. The fear we experienced was too great to even think about this place. Our parents didn't believe us when we told them what happened and thought we were just imagining things. But over time, terrible memories began to torment us. We experienced nightmares, saw that playground in our dreams as a place of nightmares. We all began to feel that it was haunting us, that day had left a certain mark on us that could not be avoided. Our friendships have also changed. We could no longer look each other in the eyes, and talking about what happened became taboo for us. The friendship we once shared gradually fell apart under the influence of fear, leaving room for misunderstanding and hatred. A few years later, one of us returned to the camp to make sure that the playground was gone forever. But to his horror, he found her still standing there as if nothing had happened. He told us about his discovery, but we refused to even listen to him. Over time, each of us found our own path and began to live separately. We no longer communicated with each other and tried to forget that terrible day, but fear remained with us, like a dark shadow that will forever remain in our hearts and minds. Eighth story. When I was little, My imagination often played cruel tricks on me. My room, especially at night, could turn into a place full of mysterious shadows and innuendo. But one day I began to see something that could not be attributed to childhood fears. It all started in a dark corner of my room. There, in the shadows, I always saw something resembling an eye. It was small and blue, and seemed to be constantly watching me. At the beginning, I thought it was my fantasy, but every night it became more and more obvious. Every evening, when I went to bed, I turned to this dark corner to make sure that the eyes really existed. He moved slowly, as if someone was watching me. I felt his gaze, motionless and gloomy. I soon began to feel incredibly anxious. I couldn't sleep at night, and my parents thought it was just a little child's nightmares. But I was sure that this was not a nightmare. The eye was real, and it remained forever in the dark corner. One day, when I couldn't sleep again because of this strange look, I decided to end it. I stood up and walked to the dark corner where the blue eye was. But when I got closer, he disappeared. My parents didn't believe me, thinking it was pure fantasy. They consoled me and told me it was just my imagination. But I knew I saw that blue eye, and it still left a mark on my soul forever. I no longer felt alone in my room, because I now knew that the eye was always watching me. Over the years, my life continued to evolve, and I became an adult. Adults, as a rule, refuse to believe in such horror stories, and I, too, decided not to pay attention to past experiences. The eye in my childhood room seemed like a distant story that had become a thing of the past. However, when I was about 25, I returned to my parents' house after many years of absence. The night was quiet, and I decided to spend it in my children's room. As soon as I got into bed, my gaze accidentally fell on an old familiar place in the corner of the room. The blue eye appeared again. He looked at me, just as motionless and gloomy as in those ancient days. I couldn't believe my eyes. All the fears and worries I had as a child came back in an instant. I tried to close my eye, but when I opened my eyes again, it remained there. I got out of bed and decided to explore this dark corner of the room. Approaching him, I tried to touch the eye with my hand, but it disappeared. Since then, I have never slept in that room again. I left my parents' house and never returned there again. The eye remained behind me, like the ghost of my childhood nightmares forever standing before my eyes. And although I am now an adult, he still watches over me, reminding me that there is a place in this world for unknown and scary things. Ninth story. When I was little, I often spent my summer holidays with my grandmother in her old house on the outskirts of the city. There were always a lot of interesting things that attracted the child's attention. But one day, while I was rummaging around in the attic, I came across an old photo album that changed my life. The photographs were old, yellowed, and covered in dust. They depicted my relatives: grandmother, grandfather, mother, and even my great-grandmother and great-grandfather. I spent hours looking at each of them, wondering what they looked like in their youth. But one day, when I looked closely at one of the photographs, I felt strange. My grandparents were smiling at me in this photo, as if they knew I was looking at them. And suddenly, they began to move. My relatives in the photo seemed to come to life and slowly began to talk to me. At first, I didn't believe my eyes, but they talked to me, asked how I was doing, told me about their lives. I was amazed and delighted at the same time. I was able to communicate with my ancestors and learn about our family history. But as time passed, I realized that something was wrong. They began to predict the future, and their predictions came true. They told me about events that would happen in a few years, and everything came true like clockwork. I got scared and decided to close the album. But my relatives in the photographs begged me not to leave. They said that they were alone in the world outside of this album. I was at a dead end, not knowing what to do. The story with the magic album continues, and I cannot stop this strange communication with my ancestors. Every day they predict future events for me, and I am afraid to find out what will happen next. Several weeks passed, and my life turned into a real nightmare. My relatives in the photographs not only predicted future events, but also began to demand something more from me. They wanted me to do their bidding. It all started with simple requests. They asked me to water their graves in the old cemetery, restore the old family estate, and even conduct religious ceremonies in their memory. I complied with their requests because I could not restrain myself in the face of my family's insistence. However, over time, their requests became increasingly strange and demanding. They forced me to collect strange objects, spend nights in the cemetery, and even participate in rituals that seemed to me to be something ancient and mystical. I started to lose my mind and feel like they were affecting me. My friends and parents noticed that something was wrong with me. They saw me turn into a strange and lonely person, absorbed in communicating with my relatives in photographs. They tried to help me, but I couldn't give up this connection. Now I realize that my ancestors in the photographs carry an ominous force and intend to use me for their dark purposes. I understand that I need to break this connection, but I don't know how to do it. My life has become a real hell, and I'm afraid this is just the beginning of a terrible story. 10th story. On that summer day, when my friends and I went to play in the forest, nothing foreshadowed trouble. The sun was shining brightly, the birds were chirping, and the children were running happily through the thick green forest, shouting joyfully and playing hide and seek. We had already been in the forest for several hours when we accidentally stumbled upon an abandoned building. It was an old, crumbling house, surrounded by thick foliage and wild grass. Our eyes were full of curiosity, and we decided to explore this place. When we went inside, we found that the house was filled with old furniture and scattered things. The walls were covered in mold and the air smelled acidic. We carefully explored the rooms, and in one of them we discovered a dark door leading to the basement. Our hearts beat faster when we decided to go down to the basement. My friend Max came down first, and his scream pierced my ears as I followed him. Inside the basement we saw ancient dolls hanging on ropes and a huge table covered with gloomy paraphernalia. But the worst thing was discovered in the corner of the room. There, in a small cage, sat the burnt, creepy figures of children. They looked nothing like normal children. Their faces were distorted with agony and fear. They didn't make a sound. They just looked at us with their empty eyes. We ran out of this terrible place, screaming and crying, and ran back into the forest. We told our parents and the police about everything. But when they arrived, the abandoned house disappeared without a trace, and the gloomy figures of the children remained in our nightmares forever. After that terrible event, we no longer appeared in that forest, but the nightmares about those burned children returned every night. We could not forget their faces and their silent gaze, which seemed to pierce our souls. Our parents tried to convince us that it was just a nightmare, but we knew the truth. Over the years, we tried not to remember what happened and survived this nightmare. We even moved to another city, but the shadow of that old house and its sinister inhabitants was always with us. Children our age exchanged scary stories about that forest and mysterious disappearances. And then, a few years later, when I was already a teenager, I accidentally came across an old newspaper in the local library. It told about the strange disappearance of a group of children in the forest and described an old house that was considered cursed. I realized that this was the same group of children we found in the basement. Then I decided to find out more. With the help of our friends and the internet, we began to research the history of this place. We learned that the old house was indeed considered cursed and that mystical events took place there in the past. It turned out that at the beginning of the 20th century, there lived a family who practiced black magic and sacrificed children in their dark rituals. This information confirmed our fears and nightmares. We decided not to investigate this place any further and let it remain in the past. But even now, when we grow up, We sometimes see those empty eyes and hear the silence of those children who remained in that abandoned house, victims of an ominous family cursed by black magic.